weapons. He didn't set out to conquer anybody. He went out to trade. He went over there to this rich land to set up trade. And that appears what really happened. These different groups came over not to take it. There might have been conflicts, I'm sure, but the main thrust of all these things was to set up trade in a mutual bargaining system, and that's what created the Olmec civilization. Because Olmec civilization, I don't mean to say it's totally black, that it was something that was created only for black people. But no, the leadership was black. And they used and they cooperated with the native people to create an indigenous civilization. You see, this is the thing where our critics, the archaeologists will say, oh, Olmec civilization has nothing to do with the blacks, because if that was the case, you'd have an African civilization that's transported into America, and that's not what the Olmecs are. But we're not saying that, see. The Olmec civilization is where you brought black expertise, black mineralogy and so on, worked with the local people and created something different. That was the Olmec civilization. So that is the thing to realize, that there is a spirit of cooperation. It's through respect, and we have a historical precedent for that now, see. And I think that leads to lessons for the future. They didn't abuse the environment. They created a great civilization that lasted for a long time. Well, that's about all. I don't want to keep you out too long on this. I'm going to show you some slides, and if you have any questions, you can certainly interrupt the action here. I think we have to probably douse these lights, though. Now, this is just a simple example of the contacts between Africa, North Africa, and Mexico. I'm going to start off very simply at first. This is an Egyptian god, ancient Egyptian god called Sobek. And it's portrayed with the body of a man and the head of a crocodile. Now, this does not mean that the ancient Egyptians believed such a monstrosity actually existed. This is a symbol of protection. You see, he's there with a little boy, with Pharaoh's son, Amenhotep III. The idea of the crocodile's power, and the man's body represents the spirit. So it's a spirit of protection. His name is Sobek. Now, on the other side of the world, we have here at a place called Bonampak, which is in Mexico, central Yucatan. You have here an alligator-headed man. He has, growing out of him here, a lotus, which is the exact same symbol associated with Sobek, by the way, which is a symbol of rebirth, regeneration. He is also a guardian. This is supposed to be one of the kings, one of the protecting deity. His name was Sipankali, which is not that far from Sobek. This is a representation of what Sobek would have basically looked like. He's holding an ankh, which is a symbol of life, which has also been found in some of the temples in Mexico. And this is the scepter of his authority. Now here is just one of the 19 Olmec heads that are found all over Veracruz. Now what's interesting too is that all of these black heads have been found in Tres Zapotes. Now that's interesting because Tres Zapotes was the old capital of the Aztec Empire. So in other words, these were the top guys. Now, the real debate is, what were they? Were they kings, or were they something else? This is a representation of another a badly damaged structure, a statue nonetheless, that was found in a tomb in Mexico. This is one of the common heads that is found also in Vera. Now, interestingly enough, there are a number of these black representations which show no body, show just the head. What does that mean? The head was considered amongst many Mesoamerican civilizations as the seat of the soul, that the body itself was relatively unimportant. The eyes and the head and so forth and the skull were considered sacred. This is a representation of what appears to be a god that was found, that has suggested of Negroid characteristics, but it was found buried with the bones of a black person, also in Mexico. I'm going to back up here just a little bit to this one again. Now the helmet, or the headgear, goes down over the ears and covers the whole skull quite well. It appears to be made of some flexible material like leather, almost like a football helmet. This is an indication of what this person might have really been. He may not have been a king, but he may have been somebody which was considered even more important. The Olmecs, as I said, had a sacred ball game. Their name comes from the name rubber for Olmec. This rubber ball. This ball game they played represented the course of the sun across the sky. The ball symbolized the sun. And it was played, this game was played by two opposing teams. And whoever won the ball game was considered the most important man in society, whoever won that game. Now, things were a little different in those days. If you were the captain of the team which won, they chopped your head off. Now, that was not punishment. That was reward, because it was believed that in the moment of victory, keeping the sun across the sky, if you were immediately decapitated, your soul flew up right away to heaven, and you became one of the companions of God, the sun god. If this is true, it explains why these heads are shown without bodies and why they were buried. It is conceivable that this is the leader of a sacred sports team who, after he won, after he became victorious, was beheaded, memorialized for some period of time, and then ritually buried. This was needed because the ancient belief was that the sun needed companions. The spirit of the sun needed companions, sacrifice. And only the best would be acceptable. The idea that we see in movies that slaves were being sacrificed to the gods, that's not true. You sacrificed only your best people to the gods. It'd be like going to a birthday party, you know, and giving them a box of cornflakes or something, you know. If you want to give somebody a gift that's something special, you give it of yourself, your highest gift. So these were either kings, regents, or they were these ritual captains. However, it is described in Panama that there was a black king. They describe him as a black king. This is a from-life drawing made in 1820 of a man in Southern California. And he belongs to a group of people they call no, they don't have the name. The name no longer exists. They died of diseases that were introduced. The Spanish chronicled at least one, possibly two black tribes in Southern California. Where could these people have come from? Now, this is another typical representation of the blacks that are found in Mexico. This is one that is found primarily in central Mexico. What's interesting, this face portrays West African facial features, most definitely. This is someone who came across the sea in ancient times to help build that great civilization. However, this face shows a combination of West African traits and other traits. The mouth and so on supposedly is related to West Africa. The eyes, someplace else. So it's a mix of something. Now this is an idea. I can explain how easy it was. Easy if you had the brains and the guts to do it. Here we're talking about these great black African kingdoms, Ghana, Mali, and so on. They're all along here. And I told you about the great African admiral who loaded up his fleet of 400 ships. Now, if they understood navigation and they understood the currents, which only a civilized people could do, and you had the proper boats for it, you couldn't do this in a dugout, you had to have a real ship, one of those power canoes, you could plug into something known as the Canary Current, which goes right off the coast of West Africa. If you ride that current, you know how to ride that current, it takes you directly across the middle of the Atlantic and takes you directly to the spot where all of these heads are found. This is where they are found, off the tip of Yucatan. It's a straight shot. And you want to go back, you ride the currents back this way. It's a long trip, but it will work. Interestingly enough, when Columbus sailed to America for the first time, he used the Canary Island Current. When Thor Heyerdahl made his balsa raft called Ra, he also used the Canary Island Current and took him directly there. Now that explains West African origins. This is a photograph from a Japanese magazine, which comes out a lot better in our magazine that came out a few months ago. This is part of this great sunken pyramidal platform off the coast of Okinawa. There doesn't appear to be anything damaged. This is some kind of a step. Goes around this way. Give you an idea of the size. These are divers in the background. This particular feature is about 100 feet below the surface. It's connected to other similar features like this up here, so that they grade up slowly. It's about 580 feet long. It appears to be a series of temples. Under here there are like square-cut chambers. No one has any idea how old this structure is because the current is so swift. Coral has a hard time growing here. If coral had grown over time slowly, they'd be able to get some kind of an idea of a date. But the currents are so rough that they swipe it all away. The only thing we have to go on are oceanographers. And they tell us that this area was above water about 8,000 years ago. This is a diver, I'll show you here, swimming in one of the arches. This is about 100 feet underwater also. You see these are massive stones, beautifully placed. The diver is swimming in between here. It's about 100 feet down. This is a flight of huge, enormous steps. Now, there's no diver in this picture, unfortunately, to give you scale, but a diver's height would be about from where you see this to about here. So they're big. These large steps look like they were made for processions. Not any single man or person. You cannot see it in the photograph, but there are smaller steps within these large steps. Goes up here. There's kind of a walkway. Again, this structure is so enormous, you cannot fit the whole thing in one photograph. The best way to see it is in a video. And we do have a video of it. It's mind-boggling. The only way you can get an appreciation of it is when you're swimming over it all. But to give you some idea of the massiveness of it. It's all laid out in very straight, rectilinear fashion. And what it most resembles is this place. This is right on the coast of Peru. This is an ancient pre-Inca temple. This is before the Incas. The Incas got going only like about 1300 AD. This temple goes back at least 1,000 years before them. And there's a similarity. Notice here again the steps in this, and go back to Japan. Now this is, keep in mind, this is on the coast of Peru, South America. And see, there's a kind of general similarity in the basic linear outline. The structure as a whole closely resembles this. This is called the Pyramid of the Sun. It's an enormous adobe pyramid. It's in bad shape now thanks to the Spaniards. It was in much better shape before they came. It's an enormous adobe pyramid that was built by people called the Mochica. Again, pre-Inca. This goes back at least 2,000 years ago. Again, you have these kind of platforms and right angles. To give you an idea of the size, there's people there. What the Spaniards did, this is all mud brick, but when it's fired, it becomes almost imperishable. When the Spaniards came here, they dug a huge trench, and there's a river nearby, and they forced the river to go through and cleaned out the whole inside because they thought there was treasure and stuff inside. And they were right. It was just like a fortune in gold came out. They opened up this side and then the other side, and when they got inside, they couldn't find their way around because there were all these caverns and stuff, and they were afraid to get lost in there. As a matter of fact, a dog did get lost inside. So they figured, well, rather than do it that way, we'll just flood the whole thing out, you know. I mean, so they opened up a trench through here and on the other side, and they let the river come through, and on the other side, water came in this side, and just a stream of gold came out on the other side. So that's an anecdotal thing, but similar there. This is what that same structure I showed you looked like originally. It was red, too, because as part of it, paint exists still. The reason I'm showing it to you is because if you were to see that structure underwater in its completeness, in its entirety, it would resemble this very similarly. So here you got something in Japan, something in America, with a real close call. This is a model of another place, also in Peru, a place called Pachacamac. It's about 400 miles south. This also is very similar to what we're seeing in Okinawa. This is another place in Peru. This is, in Bolivia. This is high up in the Andes. Again, very similar to the setup in there. This is this wall that I told you about. It's just been uncovered from the sand that's more or less protected it for 2,000 years. This is a place called Chanchan, belonged to people called the Chimu, and this is the wall of their history. Further down, you'll see how people arrived in Peru and so on. And here, this at the very beginning, it shows these pyramids with fish swimming over the top. It's another example. There you can see the fish a little bit better. Now, how is it possible that people could have gone across the Pacific, for gosh sakes? Again, if you are dealing with a very competent maritime people, here we have the great civilizations of the Incas, the Mochica, the Chimu, all along here that I just showed you. Over here in Japan, this is where the sunken structures are, down here. So if you know how to work the currents, you can at least traverse this area pretty well and plug into this area here. So it's not impossible that they could navigate those, but there's a better explanation than these currents. This is a visualization of what Mu or Lemuria looked like. I wish I could be more detailed. This is a painting which is based on the collective details of various myths from Asia, Africa, and the New World. And apparently these myths are telling the truth, because this painting was made like about 60 years ago, and yet it's portraying essentially the same type of architecture that we're seeing under the water in Okinawa, again square cut. Lemuria was a very mountainous place. It was very rich. The people there were extremely powerful culturally. Apparently this civilization was a good civilization. They did not abuse the environment. The Atlanteans did, that's another story. But the Lemurian people, after they reached this very high level of material wealth, became very interested in spiritual ideas. And it was as they were developing these spiritual ideas that this land began to fight a losing battle with the sea. We don't know exactly what happened. However, Lemuria is on part, and I say is because I'll show you the map shortly, is on what is known as the Ring of Fire. And the Ring of Fire is this enormous tear, a rip in the ocean bottom that skirts the entire Pacific. It's called the Ring of Fire because it's a ring of volcanoes. Islands are sinking and rising all the time. So what happened is that somehow this disaster undermined the foundations of Lemuria, and the place slowly sank and they had to leave. And what we're finding now in Okinawa are just the remnants of this. This will give you some idea what the place looked like. It was beset by geologic violence. As I said, the Ring of Fire is composed of literally thousands of volcanic features such as this. This is another painting of Lemuria that was done only about 20 years ago. And it's an attempt to show what may have happened in its last moments, because there are some traditions that some people were killed. Most people got away, but there was like a violent upsurge before everyone could leave, and unthinkable tidal waves overwhelmed part of it. And again, you see the disaster in its final episode. The area was also probably susceptible to this phenomena, which you don't find in the Atlantic. The Ring of Fire produces a lot of gas, which is not incandescent, just thin gas. It only then takes a slight spark to set off this incandescence, which are these great clouds of fire. Now, some of the myths related to Mu and Lemuria talk about clouds of fire which terrorized the people, set the trees on fire. The people ran up the sides of the mountains to try to escape clouds of fire. When those clouds of fire were discussed, first of all, in the myths, the archaeologists said, well, that's just a story, a fable. They didn't know about this incandescent gas, which does take place only in the Pacific, so far as we know, not in the Atlantic, where you have violent outgassing. So the last days of Lemuria, you may have had a scene like this. Now, it's not known that there was a major volcanic eruption on Lemuria itself, although it's suggested nonetheless. And again, this will give you an idea of its last moments. And then the final tidal wave, as it were. There's a Native American tradition of the Navajo who talk about great waves of water coming in over this land, which they don't identify, the land of their ancestors. It's a wonderful story, even though its details, I wish there were greater details, but they talk about how their ancestors lived on this great island paradise in the Pacific. They do say it was definitely Pacific, with a number of other what are now known as foreign peoples, but were considered brothers at that time. Really interesting. Considered just variations of the same family, who are considered now, they say, foreigners and aliens. And they lived on this island, and then these great waves rolled in. Most of the people escaped. Some did not, and they were transformed into fishes. Now, this is the map of Scripps Oceanographic, which has all these wonderful details of the bottom of the Pacific that were not available to civilians before the end of the Cold War. And what it shows here, from here all the way out across the middle of the Pacific, are a line of archipelagos that are not deep, which means that they sunk recently. What's particularly interesting is that this area here is actually was at one time actually connected to Peru. So if you had a people developing on this, physically connected here at one time, if you have a people that are developing early races of whites and blacks that are not related to Europe or Africa, and the first civilization, it's only natural then that you're going to see parallels of blacks in Peru and in Mexico, because it's no big deal to get there, even if it extends over here. That also makes sense that if this land was destroyed, that you had groups going in different directions. That's why people in Asia have the story of Mu, and why some of the Tibetan traditions trace directly back to this lost civilization. They call them the Rutas. And this place was kind of engraved, really, in the beginnings of all cultures. Now, what about these blacks that went eventually were great seafarers? What do they call them? They call them the Moors. Well, the word Moor doesn't really make any sense in any African language, but if you break it down, it looks like a corruption of the people or the person of Mu, because the R is a determination. It's not the real word, so it would be like Mu-R. So it could have been part of this proud heritage, and it seems that way. The trouble is, of course, is that now it's up to us to try to make sense of all this, because the great disaster of the modern European infestation of America wiped all this clean. There was a bishop, his name was De Landa, and he was a Catholic Spanish bishop. And when he came to the Americas, he was put in charge of all of Yucatan. This is about 1590, I guess, something like that. And he got to be real friends with the Mayan Indians. He said, "Oh, it's very interesting. Bring me all your books." So they brought him all these books, and their books were interesting. They were just long leaves all attached together. And they had the entire history of their people, their astronomy, their science, their folk tales, their medicine, everything. And he put them in a big pile and burned them. Totally gone. Now, he wasn't the only one that did that. You duplicate that over and over again. The only one that survived out of all that Mayan history is something called the Popol Vuh. The Popol Vuh you can still read today. And in the Popol Vuh, it says, a black people came across the Sunrise Sea to teach us how to work gold. It's in the Popol Vuh. That's all it mentions. We don't know the rest of it because the Popol Vuh isn't really a history book. They just mention that in passing. All this, the real story's gone. But it's enough to show us at least that it really happened. This, I really believe now, is Mu or Lemuria. You cannot ignore tradition. You cannot ignore all these physical remains. Certainly cannot ignore what's going on off the coast of Japan. Interestingly, too, the people that live in Okinawa are different racially and linguistically than the rest of the people in Japan. They don't even regard themselves as Japanese. They have strong roots throughout Polynesia. They just sort of seem to peter out somewhere. You can trace genetically some of the people, the Okinawans, through the Pacific, other Pacific islanders, and then it seems to vanish. And it vanishes right around here because this area is gone. Well, that really is all I had to show. I don't want to keep you all night. I'm such a fanatic on this that I could talk forever. So if you have any questions at all, or is anything I can try to answer for you, I'd be glad to. Really, I've answered all. Yes.
One of the keys was the bone profile.
Yeah. No. The reason why is there used to be something known, or there is something known as radiocarbon dating, and that is they measure the deterioration of carbon over time and they come to a date. Well, that whole process was built on the idea that there's the same amount of carbon in the atmosphere now as there was thousands of years ago. And it's only just occurred to scientists now, oh, gee, we forgot to take into account that there was less carbon in the atmosphere then than now. And so all their dates are messed up. And so now they're having to recarbon date things. However, the Olmec heads, the guys with the leather-type helmets, they are pretty well dated to 3,200 years ago because they've used things other than carbon dating. There's crystals that are in part of the eyes, which they've been able to date, and crystallization that took place, and things buried with them and so on. The one that you're referring to, I think, is rather late, probably like about only 1,000 years ago, maybe 1,000 years ago, which means there were blacks continuously involved in these societies until the arrival of Europeans. Not quite what? Well, that's because it's probably what we would call primitive sculpture, but it's just as a matter of stylization. That one is also relatively late. You have to figure that the Spaniards destroyed so much that we're lucky to have really anything, you know. Yeah.
I studied from an esoterical level, and in my studies that the land of Mu or Lemuria was the third root race when we were androgynous and the sexes split into male and female. And also when the island sunk, if you travel past the Rocky Mountain, that whole fault, part of it slammed against the coast of North America and created that mountain strand all the way from Alaska down to the Andes. And if you cross over the Rocky Mountains, you'll find that everything is different there. The trees are larger, the culture is different there. Mm-hmm. So that was original part of the land of Mu that slammed against the continent of North America. And I'm not getting into Atlantis, but this is from my studies on the esoteric and the metaphysical level.
Right, you're talking about Rudolf Steiner there.
No.
No?
No.
Oh, okay.
Rudolf Steiner is not the only someone who talked about the land of Mu.
Right, yeah, right. I'm not really too much in the esoteric of it because I know people differ on that quite a bit. And so I'm just trying to find the hard evidence that everybody can use to build on, you know, and...
Now you're speaking of the city of Japan. There is also, it's something like the Bermuda Triangle that's there over there on the coast of Okinawa, also on Florida, and it's another vortex over in that.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised.
On a similar, like the line, like the equator, if you draw a line across it, they're located in the same location.
There seem to be correspondences. Yes, sir.
Question, I was reading earlier this week, as a matter of fact, about some bones that were found. Now, this is the other coast now. We're getting over to the East Coast. I'm talking about Jamestown. And some bones of some Indians, what was earlier thought to be Indians, and now they found out that they were black. Mm-hmm. And they're saying that they were the bones of the black slaves.
Right. As soon as they find black bones, they immediately they think they're slaves. Right away, they say immediately they're slaves.
And, I guess that's what I'm saying. They didn't present any evidence that says, okay, these people were slaves.
Well, it was the same thing with... Right away they say they're slaves. When they found those heads, they said, oh, they're slaves, right off, without even looking into it. Or when they found the bones, they think they're slaves. But you see now, with all of the new scientific dating this year, well, it's not possible. You know, they were something else. I just learned here from somebody in our audience that there's a cemetery that's been found in New York of a black population, an actual black population in New York that was definitely before Columbus, that they were able to actually trace back the origin of the name, like the word Broadway and Spring Street to the shipbuilding people that were there in New York. It makes a great deal of sense. And I think that that place was probably had to do with this great copper trade, because that was, copper in those days was like what plutonium is to our atomic age, because from copper you made bronze, you made tools, you made the best weapons, so it was vitally important. And I think that this place in New York might have been part of that. And they are not slaves, because you do not memorialize people, like I say, like that.
You mentioned New York. What part of, was that the
I don't know.
island, or was that?
I don't know. I just heard about it from this gentleman here earlier tonight. I don't know like that. I'm all new to it.
Of what we call the Montauk Indians?
The Montauk Indians, right.
Okay, well, I think they were on Long Island, northern end of
Mm-hmm.
Long Island.
Right, that's where
some pyramids or whatever that
The Montauk
mounds,
Pyramid.
Up in that area. And some of the things that had happened to them in their land being taken from them, they were supposedly mixed with some black population, but I'm speculating as to whether they may have already been black or mixed with black or...
I don't know. It's really believable. It's really possible, considering all these other ones.
I was thinking about the family names that they had, like Pharaoh and...
Oh, wow. That's pretty good. Maybe so. Yes?
In your studies on the beheading, the ritual beheading,
Yeah.
did you find out what they did with the rest of the body?
The rest of the body was no longer important because the body just belongs to Earth. But the head, right. For example, they used to also have skull racks. You would go into town and you see the racks of all these skulls and you go, oh, that's pretty horrible stuff, but it really wasn't. These were all like their saints or their top people. And it was a form of memorializing them. By preserving their skull, it meant this person is in heaven now. It's like an assurance that they're with the top sky god now.
Well, they had a special...
Pardon me?
Trying to figure what they did with the rest of the
I don't know. I can't say, but I know they discarded it because they didn't consider it really important. It was the head. These black people that are sculpted with these great sculptures, they were all found buried. I mean, the sculpture is found buried, not just thrown in a hole. I mean, buried with grave goods and honorably put into the ground. So, they were important people.
You must remember that once upon a time the earth was one land mass before it split, and the people were able to trek out over the earth. And also you can travel underground all the way from the coast of Antarctica to the North Pole. And Tuesday night they had a special, on a 4-hour special on Channel 8 on tracking the Aztecs
Oh, huh.
all the way from where they left from the Americas down into South America.
Oh,
and
my.
I watched it. It was very interesting.
Right. And it's really fascinating stuff. I think we are on the verge of a new history, and that everything that we've been told and our parents have been told is going to be thrown out. And in coming generations, we're going to have a whole new way of looking at our past. That's one of the great things I think we can look forward to in this century, is that we can throw away all these wrong ideas that still mess us up and see what really happened, That we all have roots in this country that go far back before Columbus, Yeah.
The people who did the beheading, were they important people also?
Yes, anybody. It was a religion, It was a religious rite. You were a privileged person if you won that. And the person that was engaged in it understood that if I win this game, I'm going to be beheaded. Now, this doesn't mean that anything bad happened to the losers. It was, just part of the game. But if you won, you were considered a privileged character, and it seems barbaric to us, but at least we can understand where they're coming from anyway. Now, that isn't necessarily what happened. I mean, that's our interpretation, which might be wrong. I don't mean to say that just because that's my interpretation, that's what it was. I could be totally wrong on that. It could be they are just monuments of kings. That's possible too. But I do know they had this ball game, and I do know that they did cut off the heads of captains when they won. Now, whether that's them or not, I don't know, but it could be. It could be. With all the written records are gone, They
did it immediately after the game.
Yeah, that appears to be the case, right? Because the Aztecs did. They would cut off the head of the guy right afterwards, right in the moment of his victory, of his triumph.
So the audience probably stayed.
Oh yeah, that was the big finale, But I mean, it was good because the captain went through a ceremony. He was totally praised by his whole society. The emperor himself thought this man was like God. He was deified, And everybody's cheering at that moment. Well, that's a good way to go, I suppose. I mean, Everybody's cheering you on in a way, you know. But this is not to say that this is only what the blacks did. This is only what some did. They weren't all involved in this. They were also involved in a lot of seamanship and a lot of gold. One thing I wanted to bring out too is that, as a matter of fact, the word for gold, interestingly enough, in West Africa was called, let's see if I pronounce this right, guanines. Guanines, that's a West African word, guanines, for gold. When Columbus was talking to the natives in San Salvador, they referred to gold as guanines. Same thing. So there's a lot of more parallels than I have time to talk about here. Well, I thank you all for coming and letting me share this with you, and I hope you find our magazine worthwhile. The purpose of Ancient American is to get facts like this out. Our issue, as you can see, is dedicated to this, and we're going to keep telling the truth, even though the archaeologists keep saying that we're full of baloney. But I don't think we are. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your coming.